it's been such a journey for you to get into that England kit, hasn't it? Like, let's take it back to the beginning of your journey with football. When did you first fall in love with football, and when did you first get that dream that you wanted to be a football player?
Um, for me, taking it right back to the start, it was at the age of 3, 4, watching my brothers play in the garden with the local neighbours. I lived in a court in LA, and one of our neighbours had like a big garden, and he created a football pitch for us, and that's where all the boys played for a few years, and I just used to watch them. Then one day they asked me to join in, and I never looked back really.
What have been some hurdles and stumbling blocks you've really had to overcome in order to realize your dreams, would you say?
I think the stumbling blocks that I've came across is definitely accessibility. I lived in the city Liverpool, and the elite academies were all on the outskirts of Liverpool, so that's at least 45 minutes to an hour drive. But my mum didn't drive, so I had to depend on my uncles, my aunties, or just parents of other players to be able to get there. And I was quite lucky in the fact that I did have people that were willing to take me and were just as dedicated as me to be able to, help me realize my dream. And I feel like that's a common denominator for many inner city communities and many young players coming from these communities is the accessibility to get to these academies.
The mental side of sport is so intrinsic to your performance, and I feel like we're only just waking up to how mental health can
Yeah.
impact performance as well, especially when we look at athletes like Naomi Osaka who have really opened up about it and been able to talk about it and also change the way that people approach it in sport. How do you think that your mental well-being and mental health has affected your performance at different points, and how have you learned to keep a balance between your mental health and also being a professional athlete?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I do think that mental health is only just really being understood within football as a sport, and sports in general. Really, it's a very taboo subject. Nobody wants to really talk about it, and I truly do praise those people who do because it really helps others when they're not willing to speak up for themselves. And I think mental health, you do go through ups and downs in football. There's many that you go through, and I always got told this one line: never get too high and never get too low. And that stops you really from going on a roller coaster of emotions. If you try and stay on an even keel, even through the good times as well as the bad, that you'll never really put yourself where you have like a dramatic change in your emotional state.
A lot has been said around the gender disparity in sport. There's so much more room to go, and there's so much more we need to do to actually make a gender equality happen in sport. For you, what still frustrates you around the sexism and the gender disparity in sport?
I think the most frustrating part is how people directly compare the men's and the women's game because
Mm.
men and women historically, physically, emotionally, mentally are very different human beings. Men are built in a certain way that allows them to have more power, more physical presence than a woman has. So for me, when you try and compare the men's game, like the women's game is much slower and stuff like that, that's a real frustration because people tend to always directly compare, will never see the beauty in what the women's game does produce. And there'll always be, I guess, them direct comparisons um, to the women's game. And then there's the argument about, you know, the pay and how the women's culture doesn't produce in as much money as the men, and that's true. We don't have the revenue that the men does, but our game is like 50 years behind the men's. So we need to allow it to have time to be able to develop. The the depth and quality of player is so much vaster in the men's game than it is the women's because ultimately from a young age women are taught men's a football's game.
Mm.
Football is a men's game. That is some of the most frustrating elements of for me as a football player because ultimately my mum never said to me, Nikita, you can't pick up a ball, you have to pick up a Barbie doll. So we need to try and change the mindset, the culture of how we raise our children to give them the best opportunity to be the best at what they can do, whether it's football or netball, or whether it's computers or another aspect, aesthetics, nails. To me, you just got to give your child the opportunity and the open the horizon to be able to choose what avenue they want to go down. Don't force them to be able to be in a certain stereotypical way.
Did you feel seen and represented when you were growing up?
No, not in women's football. I didn't feel like, when I watched games that there were many black women playing in the league. There's still not today. There's less than 12% currently playing in the league. So I know how, young women, young black women feel growing up in today's world, because there's not much representation at the highest level, where they see a pathway, or they feel a sense of I can attain that dream. But for me, that's the challenge off the pitch for me, to help make sure that they do feel that there's a pathway, and they have an opportunity to have those role models, to be able to look up to, and to aspire to feel like they're walking in the same footsteps.